Oh, for the recording. We're recording. That's right. Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you're all doing well. We have been in a lot of sessions the last couple of days, so I know everyone is on information overload, and if you're like me, you will need time to process and think about all the stuff that we have been hearing, but if you're like me, I hope you've also been very inspired by the conversations that we've had today. So, and yesterday. My name's Angela Deane. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Human Rights Watch, and I am very glad to be sharing the stage with Tanya Greene, my wonderful colleagues, the Director of the U.S. program. You all just heard from Tanya, with Bruno Stagno Ugarte, and with Frances Underhill to talk about our work in the United States. But we are talking about it in a little bit of a different way than what you just heard Tanya talk about on the stage, not necessarily on the theme of authoritarianism, but what's some of the work that we're doing in the United States right now that you may not know about, some that may be behind the scenes? What are some of the U.S. domestic priorities that we're working on, and how are we engaging with different and creative audiences to get the message across and to build engagement across the U.S.? So that's setting the stage. I am going to direct the first question to Tanya. So I'll ask each of my colleagues a question, and then we'll open it up and have a vibrant Q&A. Tanya, can you explain or expand a little bit on how your team is creating advocacy strategies or building on advocacy strategies under this new administration, because it is a different administration than what we've worked with in the past?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it's that time of day where you're just feeling punchy and everything is a joke, but I'm not going to do it to y'all, so we're just going to stay straight here. So, you know, the typical way that we work is research and advocacy related to the research, and communications, strategic communications related to the research. We often feed litigation and policy advocates with our research to, you know, provide the underpinnings of the legal cases or the policy efforts to roll back bad policies or introduce new policies. For instance, I'm not sure how many of you all, because you're not in the immigration session that's happening simultaneous to this one, I will just share that, for instance, we wrote a declaration about CCOT in the prison in El Salvador that a lot of the Venezuelans were sent to suddenly in February, earlier this year. And that declaration has gone all around in tons of cases now. It's been quoted and relied on, and was actually mentioned by Sotomayor in a dissent from the Supreme Court. And so those are the things that we kind of typically and traditionally do, and do them very effectively. Our team in the United States also does work that we loosely refer to as movement building, narrative change, and public or community education, which are necessarily parts of the advocacy that we do, but is not the thing that we focus on as an organization. I think that that's a direction that we're going in as an organization, because it's providing a lot more opportunities and takes advantage of all the partnerships that we have around the country and around the world in much greater ways. So I just want to, I think a lot of people have different understandings of what movement building might be, or power building, and narrative change, and community education. So I just want to give you a couple of definitions and then a couple of examples of what we've been doing. And when we get to the Q&A, feel free, we can expand on them, and we can also take new ideas, because one thing that the team is doing a lot of right now is being really creative about how we can be nimble in this moment and hit them as hard as they're hitting us, right? Movement building. One of the ways I like to define it is starting with an audacious, clear vision, possessing a deep embodiment of values and living of those values, building radical and profound community with the most impacted people, and strategically navigating toward the future. More simply put, movement building is organizing people around shared values and goals to create collective power for change. So it's long term. It's not in the moment. It's not one-off. It's also an investment with the people who are impacted most by the harms that occur and the changes that will come. And we had a session earlier today on the situation with unhoused people in Los Angeles. And that's another place where we've been doing a lot of movement building, where we're very embedded in those activist communities and are very clear then, as a result of the kind of constant meetings and constant contact that we have with impacted people in those communities, about what they need, about what they want, about what would make the difference in terms of the policy change that we're looking for. In this moment, we have, I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the ones I really like that I think is somewhat prescient, but it was a necessary scenario. A couple of years ago, the state of Texas created a program called Operation Lone Star. Anybody here from Texas? Okay. So it was a red state effort to take over some federal immigration policy work. Very, very expensive, very, very dangerous, and lethal in that it involves the local and state law enforcement in kind of running down migrants physically in the police cars and things like that. There's a lot of activity on the border itself. This is the arrangement that resulted in the buoys and the barbed wire spiked buoys that were in the Rio Grande a couple of years ago. And so we've been embedded in that movement, the End Operation Lone Star movement. And we've been doing a lot of communications work with them. That was kind of the value that we added to that effort, or that we added when we began with that effort. And as a result, we've been able to figure out with them how to talk about these issues, where the openings were in community, where their openings were in policy situations, including red state policy situations. And that's fortuitous because this is a program now the current administration is planning on expanding beyond Texas. They're moving into Florida. There are little, kind of smaller versions of it now cropping up in other states. And we're ready. So Human Rights Watch has had this experience of fighting this program and having some wins on it in Texas. And so we'll be able to leverage those wins. We have a lot of research that we've done on the deaths, for instance, the high-speed chases and the deaths, and the property damage and things that really resonate for people. If they don't care about migrants getting killed, they worry about their house getting run into, right? So you kind of respond where people, there are lots of opportunities. And so that's a movement that we're part of and that we are contributing to. And the international human rights lens is unique in Texas because, we don't need none of that human rights stuff down here, and we've inserted that into the conversation. Power building is similar, but it's specific to gaining voice and impact. I think one way to think about power building is to think about the David and Goliath scenario. So what is it that would allow a small community to stop a mega corporation from building an oil pipeline, for instance, in their backyard? The corporation's source of power is clearly money. The community needs to find other sources of power, and that's the kind of power building that we also work with communities on. And then narrative change, I'll just mention very quickly because I also think that Frances is going to talk a little bit about that. It's transforming the dominant stories, beliefs, and values in society. It involves creating and amplifying alternative frameworks, alternative stories, language, etc., that challenge the harmful stories and promote our values in the world that we're trying to build. One thing that I've heard narrative talk about, one way that I've heard narrative talked about is that we live in a narrative ocean. And if we're going to influence the narrative, if we're going to change the narrative, we have to think about drops in the ocean and creating streams with those drops and creating rivers and lakes with those drops to get to the ocean. That we can't, narrative change is not a quick thing. And then also an example is, again, our Texas work, I think, because immigration narrative is really in a bad place now. Like you really don't think about how immigrants built this country. This is the way I grew up talking about immigrants in the U.S. That's not talked about anymore. They are just, considered a scourge. The implication is it's all poor brown and black immigrants that are the dangerous ones. And we really need to pay attention to the narrative about that. We are, I'm sorry, I've got papers out of order. One other thing around movement building and power building, as well as narrative change. And I will say that a lot of this is not distinct. These are not, there's not efforts that are only movement building or only narrative change or only public education. There's a lot of overlap and intersecting is the cultivation of unlikely allies. We agree with people on certain points in certain discrete areas, and we need to take advantage of that. We're not all going to agree all the time on everything, and I think that that's a reality. I think the older we get, the more we realize. I think, when I was 20, I thought, I was going to be pure. And it was all or nothing. But I think, we are strategic and we are realistic. And developing unlikely allies is another opportunity in this Trump moment. Because, for instance, the major philanthropies, organizations that receive philanthropic money, like the Heritage Foundation, that are on the opposite side of us, are also resistant to the high taxing of philanthropy, right? So we are thinking about different kinds of allies for discrete purposes, and that's another important part of how we're thinking about it.
Thank you. No, that was great, Tanya. Thank you. And a good segue to narrative change and unlikely allies. I'm going to go to you next, Frances, because I think a lot of people in this room may not be aware of the work that Human Rights Watch does around film, kind of behind the scenes work that we do in film and television. This is relatively new for us. Our partnerships with the entertainment industry to kind of help create narrative change within the mainstream media that can help us propel our advocacy. You may be, some of you, familiar with who watched Sex and the City? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, it was like, yeah, that's the sex. It was like my college mantra. That was, 5 years ago when I was in college. But you may not be aware, or maybe you are, that the reboot of Sex and the City, which I know is not as good as the original. We all know that. But Human Rights Watch played a not so small part in a couple of the episodes there. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So Frances, tell us a little bit more about that, how that happens, and what impact it makes.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. As you all know, human rights work is law, it's policy, it's crisis response, but it's also about storytelling, and it's about creating connection. And for my colleagues to be able to do the jobs they do, we need to create a world in which everybody understands each other's humanity. And I actually love Tanya's description of drops that create streams in the ocean, and that's kind of what my team does. The entertainment industry really has an unparalleled power to shape and change how we all see the world. And especially now, we know that audiences are kind of, A, no longer looking at traditional news media in the same way to help build their way of seeing the world, and B, very heavily influenced still by the entertainment industry when they come home from work, switch on the TV, watch their favorite, maybe comedy, maybe Abbott's Elementary, or, drama like The Last of Us or The Handmaid's Tale. And to give kind of maybe a more dated example, but I think maybe one you'll all remember, if you think about the show Will and Grace, it's often been credited with helping pave the way for marriage equality in the US. And in fact, the former US President Joe Biden gave it credit and said it was one of the things that really helped change public perception on that issue. So we see entertainment as kind of like a Trojan horse. It's a way without preaching to reach people every day in their homes. So our very relatively new team, the Entertainment Advocacy team, small but mighty, we're here to embed human rights, values, messaging, narratives into mainstream, kind of culturally significant, entertainment-forward shows. And we really want to equip the studios and the entertainment industry to stand up for justice with the stories they tell. You know, we want to give them the tools, give them the resources, and make it easy for them to do so. So the way it works, the same way that my advocacy colleagues are kind of pacing the hallways of the UN or in DC with the US administration, I'm driving around the lots of the studios in Hollywood. I mean, not literally, but I am meeting with studio executives, writers, showrunners. And what we say to them is, whether intentional or not, all of their shows have human rights issues in kind of every single part of them. Everything their characters are facing, be it, you know, the water that they're drinking, the schools their children go to, the choices they make, the freedom they have to speak, the consequences for their actions on their shows, that is all their human rights. And even though the topics that we often work on might kind of seem lofty, we can provide texture and detail and authenticity to their shows and really arm their writers and creators with these things. So, you know, we say to them, for example, if you're making a comedy set in a high school in Florida, you know, let us tell you about my colleague Trey Walk's work on book bans in Florida. Let us give you a story about a mother who's really fighting for her community against fossil fuels, or a family facing deportation. Because at the heart of Human Rights Watch's work are incredible, important stories of people, individuals, fighting for justice and seeking dignity. And we say, you know, let's put these people in your shows. I want to give you an example, and I think often the studios are kind of like, well, do you mean, you know, do you want us to make a documentary, or is it going to be the new Erin Brockovich? And like, yes, these are both very important, but also I'm going to give you a sci-fi example. We worked with the Star Trek franchise, Starfleet Academy, and I mean, I don't want to give away too much of their plot, but I think I can say that they have a storyline where beings are having to leave one planet for another. And they rightfully ID'd this as a refugee migrant story. And they came to us and said, you know, we don't want to use those words, but we'd love your help and your expertise. So we brought one of our researchers in the refugee and migrant rights team into their writer's room. And she was able to bring, you know, incredible context from her work in Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and really kind of help explain to them or talk to them about, I mean, these writers, of course, are incredible, but they're not experts on why people flee their homes, what are the dangers they face, how it feels for them, and why they need to be protected. So our research was not only able to give that context, but also able to drive home that, you know, none of these characters are really just this one experience or this one thing that's happening to them, and really able to encourage them to really broaden out their idea of what these characters should look like and could act like and be. And we helped, therefore, shape a storyline on that show. We also enabled them to avoid stereotypes and create really kind of nuanced and authentic storytelling. And that's a win-win, because that, in turn, enriches their show. And that's kind of our business case to them. You know, we want to support you to create the best shows that you can. And it's an example of how we hold the line. So we're working to prevent that major franchise from advancing authoritarian propaganda or perpetuating harmful stereotypes. And we left their product better from speaking to us. And also it gives us a very large platform for our work. I mean, it's not out yet. The show comes out at either the end of this year or the beginning of next year, but we can pretty much guarantee that the new Star Trek show is going to be watched by millions around the world. I also want to give a bit of context, because I think it's worth noting that harnessing the power of entertainment's kind of enormous influence is nothing new. We know that United States propaganda efforts in film and TV date back to World War II. And since 9/11, we've increasingly seen the extensive reach and coordination of the Department of Defense and the CIA, who've consulted on a wide range of TV and film, including things like Top Gun or Homeland or Marvel's Black Panther. So we just really want to make sure that we're also in the game, and that we're helping create kind of balanced narratives for all. it's also a way for us to engage with what we call the movable middle. We're helping embed human rights ideals for a global audience that tune into the shows that are created by the US studios that we're partnering with. And I've also heard Tanya say about her team's work that we need to strengthen the vision of what our world should look like and not just be on the defensive. And I think our team is really helping to do that.
It's great. Good way to end that, Frances. And I think it does make us a little cooler, I think.
And that, I'm here to make us cooler, yes.
No, and I remember to go back to, and just like that, the Sex and the City reboot, when so for those of you who haven't seen it, there's a character, Miranda, who gets an internship at Human Rights Watch. And it's actually the character is based on one of our colleagues. And when that first came on, my phone blew up because I had, a bunch of my middle-aged friends who were obsessed with Sex and the City being like, oh my gosh. So, but now we're going to pivot back to the more wonky side of Human Rights Watch and what we're, but equally as exciting, but more of our bread and butter. Bruno, for those who don't know him, is our Chief Advocacy Officer at Human Rights Watch. And we have an office in D.C., not where Bruno is based, but we have an office in D.C. that works directly to engage with the U.S. government on myriad issues, advocacy-wise. Historically, I think it's fair to say that in every single U.S. administration, we have had some sort of access to the administration, whether it's Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. We have always had some sort of access or willingness to engage with Human Rights Watch or a seat at a table, perhaps even in Trump 1. Not this one in the same way. So how have we had to pivot? What can we do? Is it hopeless? Will they talk to us? Tell us, Bruno.
Yeah, so let's say it's not hopeless, and a bit of a more wonky side to HRW, but also as to how we are reinventing the way to engage with, yes, an uncomfortable partner, because on some issues we probably can agree with the Trump administration. For example, they are likely to support Human Rights Watch's positions pertaining to Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela or China, potentially the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Sudan. But there are many other issues on which we will profoundly disagree. So one of the things that we have been doing, and if you're familiar with the Human Rights Watch methodology, we say we investigate, we expose, and we change. Probably playing off of that, I could say that our Washington, D.C. team working on U.S. foreign policy is basically documenting, engaging, and roadblocking. So let me walk you through the three, and then I'll add a complement as to the larger effort that HRW is doing outside of Washington, D.C. proper. So with regards to documenting, obviously where Tanya started us off was the research. That is the core of the business at Human Rights Watch. So the idea is to document the very harms that the Trump administration is basically enabling, committing, perpetrating through its various actions on U.S. foreign policy, including, for example, the dismemberment of the United States Agency for International Development or reductions to international assistance. So that is something that we are documenting in tandem with so many of the divisions at Human Rights Watch, and we're preparing for a report that we want to launch around September so that it can impact on congressional deliberations about the next federal budget. So that's documenting, certainly, the harms. Secondly, we want to engage. This gets a bit trickier because this is an administration that is somewhat difficult to engage with, but it's not impossible. And let me give you a very concrete example. You might be familiar that last week, President Trump decided to lift sanctions on the Syria government. You know, Bashar al-Assad fell, and there's a new authorities in Syria. Syria has been under U.S. and multilateral sanctions for many years. Human Rights Watch has been advocating for the lifting of those sanctions because otherwise it will be impossible for the Syrian people to uplift themselves if they are subject to sanctions. Human Rights Watch was the only human rights organization that was invited to meet with the National Security Advisor team in Washington, D.C. on Syria. And what we shared was not only our documentation about what was happening in Syria, but also actually advocating for the U.S. to lift these sanctions. And we were very pleased to see that at least that recommendation has been taken on board. But secondly, that it was possible to engage with them on something where there could be some meeting of the eyes. There are other issues on which potentially we could follow suit. And I would also like to share that, for example, 2 of the advocates we have in Washington, D.C., in fact, work under the Trump first administration. That might come as a surprise to you. These are not Trumpian individuals by far. They share the very same values we all share. But I think it's a testament to the degree to which we are an impartial organization that we can have 2 of our advocates in Washington, D.C., who have worked with both Democratic and Republican administrations of whatever color, nature, or type. And I think that that gives us precisely some of that legitimacy we need in order to be able to build that engagement. Now, engagement with U.S. foreign policy officials has become more complex. That intimacy that one could have in the past is gone. So lots of that engagement now happens off-site, off the record, and you try to leave as little record as possible, written, oral, or otherwise. In many ways, it's, and I see our general counsel here, as if everything is privileged and confidential, and you try to leave no record. Because unfortunately, yes, people are being purged within the State Department. People are being purged in other agencies and bureaus. So they have to be extremely cautious. And we obviously have to be very attentive to their needs. And the third element is road blocking. And the idea here is to be able to minimize or fence in the harms that could emerge from U.S. foreign policy decisions. So this could be, for example, and speaking quite concretely, the Trump administration wanted to sanction the International Criminal Court, an organization that Human Rights Watch has played a key role in enabling and in creating. So there were many discussions about this being done through the U.S. Congress, so through law, which would make it quasi-permanent. So the idea was to try to roadblock it in the U.S. Congress so that it, in the best case scenario, it could be through an executive order, which means that worst case, it will last for years and it can be, hopefully, somehow upturned in a following administration. Or potentially that after the midterm elections, and if 3 senators flip or 3 members of the House of Representatives flip, it might be possible to somehow counteract that executive order through Congress, through a Congress that might be more forward-leaning, more like-minded. Likewise, for example, in terms of road blocking, is the idea of going to El Salvador, Panama, Costa Rica, documenting the harms of these deportations of third country nationals, and bringing that information back in a way that, first of all, will roadblock future deportation flights, because Panama and Costa Rica are no longer willing to suffer some of the opprobrium they are suffering from Human Rights Watch and others, because now they have been put basically, yes, they're being publicly pilloried because they are not living up to their international obligations. So it's those 3. So documenting, engaging to the degree that it's possible, and road blocking. But maybe I want to add a 4th, which this goes beyond the Washington, D.C. team properly, but actually it's all of the advocates working at Human Rights Watch. And this is how we engage every other country that is concerned about what is happening in the United States. And I can tell you, having been to countries like Denmark or Japan, everybody is worried. You know, when I go to Copenhagen, the first thing they want to talk about is Greenland, and we say, well, that's not a human rights issue for us. When I was in Japan, it's tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. Well, that's not necessarily our issue, but they're all worried. And so the idea, what we've been trying to do, and this is not something that we're learning on the fly, we've been doing it for a long time now, is to be able to find a first mover, a country, no matter how large or small, that is willing to basically tackle the United States on a particular issue. But because, of course, there is a certain vindictiveness if you are the first mover, how do you identify a first mover who can then find protection under a larger group of states? So how, maybe mimicking what Tanya was talking about movement building, this is coalition building, but of governments. And so what we're basically trying to do is mobilizing many sardines to create a school of fish, so that as a school of fish, they will be protected from the nasty shark. Yes? And that's what we've been doing on many issues. And I'm saying that it's working. I don't want to trouble you with a long list of all the various schools of fish we have been building over time, some of them preceding Trump 2, because we obviously had gone through Trump 1, but secondly because, to be fair, issues with U.S. foreign policy did not begin with Trump 1 or Trump 2. We've had long-standing issues with U.S. foreign policy, and if you look at just the long record of HRW research, we have been documenting harms on U.S. foreign policy for many, many decades. At times, of course, they've been a force for good, but they have also been a force for bad. And so what many of the people in my team have been doing in Germany, in Paris, in London, in Tokyo, wherever it is building, precisely identifying those first movers who will discreetly say, yes, I am willing to lead on, for example, the issue of X issue. And then we say, okay, good. We will partner with you to build a supportive group of states. And I can tell you that some of these schools of fish that we have developed, we're not talking about small numbers. For example, there is a school of fish that is working on a draft treaty on crimes against humanity, something that the Trump administration does not like. These are 11 crimes against humanity, so they basically touch on a large spectrum of the work that Human Rights Watch does, and we have 100 countries in that group. We are building a school of fish to basically try to get a moratorium on killer robots, so fully autonomous weapons. We have about 85 countries in that school of fish. We're working on an optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child for free pre-primary and secondary education, not an issue that necessarily the U.S. is enthused about. We have about 100 countries in that school of fish, and so forth. So, and I can give you even more, climate change, something that obviously the Trump administration is not enamored with. We had Vanuatu, speaking about the sardine, very small fish, right? Vanuatu, one of the smallest Pacific Island states you can imagine, leads on climate change and human rights through a request for an advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice. And we have over 150 states that are behind that. So it's this coalition building which will provide a bit of a deflective capacity to those that want to lead and to find that strength in numbers. And ultimately, it gives them some protection because the United States, or China, by the way, cannot afford to build too much animus against these large cohort of states because they need them ultimately for anything they want to do on the multilateral setting, no matter how battered or hurt or sanctioned or boycotted the multilateral system is. Because ultimately, the U.S. is, yes, it's withdrawing, but it is not entirely withdrawing from the multilateral system. So it still requires some of that connective tissue with the many other member states that participate in the multilateral system.
Thank you, Bruno.
More comments?
Please. Yeah.
Okay, just a couple more things I was thinking about I want to share with y'all. The one thing is we have been in this new iteration of things since January. We are paying a special attention to networking among partners and showcasing partners, because this is new for a lot of organizations in the United States, this kind of affront that we are engaged in. And so people are not familiar. And it's become really important to connect with global partners. And a lot of organizations don't have those links where we do as an organization. And that's another thing that we are offering to a lot of the folks we work with. One of the very specific, tangible ways that we're doing that is developing a video project / web feature. I don't know what it's actually going to look like at the end. I think there's an animated part of it too. That's lessons from democracy activists around the world for folks in the U.S. who are articulating that democracy is what we're fighting for and giving ideas about lessons and strategies and other information about how to have a protest, how to kind of stay upright, don't get kicked out of school, all of the things that happen under repressive regimes that folks in the United States are not familiar with. We're trying to help make those connections. And so making sure that those connections are drawn too. It's not just kind of an imaginary thing. It's not just theoretical. It's actually happening to folks. And then finally, our efforts around public education. I mentioned it in the larger group, but I just want to emphasize it again. We have to call it what it is. we have to name it for people, because I think that there are a lot of folks in the United States who are kind of like shocked and paralyzed and don't believe what's happening is actually happening because we don't have a language for it. And so that's something we also are doing as Human Rights Watch, and we are able to do because we have so many colleagues from around the world who are absolutely articulate about it and what it looks like and how it shows up and how it, kind of insinuates itself into your life. And so we are doing a lot of releasing of little short videos and small written pieces and things about what authoritarianism is, what it looks like, how, for instance, accountability is really key, government accountability is really key, something we've taken for granted, for decades and for, the history of the U.S., but is now being called into question. And that, folks are thinking, is it real? What am I seeing? Is this really happening? We are helping confirm that this is really happening, and here's what you can do about it. And that makes a real difference for folks, because otherwise the paralysis kind of just leads and finishes, and folks can't, get active.
Thanks. And that was actually, you answered the question that I was going to ask. So that was perfect, because I did want to just highlight and emphasize, as I think we've been doing throughout these past couple of days, how Human Rights Watch is part of a wider ecosystem. Of course, in the U.S., on the domestic issues we work on in the U.S., but globally as well. So I was going to ask you, Tanya, about that. And maybe, Frances, can I ask you about that, how that contributes to the movement building, what role Human Rights Watch plays in that context?
Yeah, it's been interesting because, in a way, the entertainment industry is like a whole new target. It's a whole new group of partners for Human Rights Watch who we haven't had as much contact with before. And so in the last almost 2 years building this program, it's really been about connection building, about meeting new people. And actually, it's great to be at the summit because we've relied on a lot of our committee members and supporters to help us do this, because we really had to kind of one connection at a time build this new ecosystem out. So we work with major studios and networks like Disney, 20th Century, like Netflix, HBO, and we also work with production companies, and then with the unions like the WGA, the Writers Guild of America. But we also work in collaboration with partners. I mean, for example, we just co-hosted a convening for the 100 Days of Trump with a group called Storyline Partners, which is a collective of other nonprofits who do similar work to us. And that was all just about kind of figuring out together how in this new world we are able to work, kind of best practices, how we can advance each other's work, and how we can kind of come together to meet the moment. So it's been it's been very interesting because it's just a whole new set of partners for Human Rights Watch, and it's been exciting to help build that out.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to move to Q&A. Before we do that, I also want to ask Bruno if he can create a graphic about the schools of fish and the shark, because I think that is a very good visual image of describing what we do. Okay, questions? Mark.
Microphone? No. Yep. Oh,
yep.
Yeah, thanks.
And please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Mark Polisi from Sydney, Australia. My wife and I were the 48-hour travel adventure that we had to get here. A question for Frances. My wife and I watched E-Team before we came, and if any of you don't know about it, it's a Netflix documentary about two Human Rights Watch investigators that broke into Syria in 2014, and we found that really powerful. We'd seen some of those short videos about what our investigators do, but I think this really brought it to a bigger audience. It's a long time since that was made. I was wondering whether there were any plans to bring our work a la E-Team to the streaming companies to broaden the work of Human Rights Watch.
You mean to kind of make a new...
make a new documentary about what the sort of work we do, and
Yeah, I'd love to. often when we go and meet these production companies and we tell them about lots of, it's funny because in my previous role at Human Rights Watch, I was working at the film festival where E-Team was once shown, and that was a lot of kind of talking to people who really, documentarians who really knew the work of Human Rights Watch really well, and the films they were making were on current human rights issues. The world, Hollywood that I'm working with now, lots of them don't really know the work of Human Rights Watch that well. So when we explain to them who we are, what we do, what our researchers do, their minds are blown. I mean, they're so impressed. And we share with them our research and our reporting, and, there's a lot of excitement. We would love for someone to make this film. And if anyone in the audience has any contacts of people who'd be willing and able to make it, I think it's a great idea. Human Rights Watch doesn't have the resources right now, and I think that E-Team came about with an external production company approaching Human Rights Watch and making that film. But that just also really speaks to the power of film and the entertainment industry, because when you watch something like that, it stays in the mind for a very long time. It gives you a really incredible look and insight into the work we do. And that's also why the new VR project we're working on is so cool, because it's another way that we can really experience the work that our researchers do.
And background for those, the E-Team stands for Emergencies Team, which is now our Crisis and Conflict team. So thanks for the question, Mark. Beth Ann.
Hi, Beth Ann, New York Executive Committee. I have two questions. First one, following up on the narrative change. I think last year in Arl, Tirana said that the greatest marketing coup of the 20th century was the right taking pro-life as their slogan. And a few years ago, we did an event with Macarena, and she talked about the powerful work that women advocates did in Latin America to change the narrative around reproductive rights and make the slogan, the language, it was, only when necessary, but a woman and doctor would decide when it was necessary. It was very effective. I would just love any perspective on why we haven't been able to shift this in the U.S. And then my second question is Harvard. What do you think about what Harvard's doing with the Trump administration? Is Human Rights Watch involved at all? And I mean, it's a big fish, Bruno. It's a big fish. So, okay. It's a big fish. But I
just answer all the questions of the day. Right?
Okay.
So I think Harvard is an interesting example. I'll just take this second first. Yeah. We are not connected. A lot of us went to Harvard and are having moments about oh, maybe I should donate now or something. But they are also still Harvard, and so there's a lot of problems there. Yeah. But they are, I think, an example that we can use of turning an obstacle into an opportunity. They knew they were under attack. They knew it was coming. They knew they were going to lose money. And, I mean, they are obviously in an endowment position that's different than many, including us, so that they can put up that kind of fight. But I think they're also empowering other people. And I think the lesson for HRW is that we are a big fish in that sense, organizationally. And there are lots of small grassroots organizations, 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, that look to us. And so we who knows when it's going to come, but it may well come in terms of, kind of being targeted as part of civil society, because under authoritarian slide, or however you refer to it, civil society does come under attack because of the social justice, human rights, freedom work that we do. It's counter to what the authoritarian government wants. So if and when that happens, we're ready in that sense. We've already indicated agreement, and we've signed on to some preemptive letters and things that are out there about kind of standing together as the NGO movement based in the U.S. So there's that, for what that's worth. And remind me of your first question again. Was it to me?
Pro-life.
Okay. Yeah, that's why, I talk with our immigration researcher pretty regularly about the strategy around the narrative And we're always throwing out ideas, but the thing is like we're not the end-all be-all on this issue, happily so, because we don't have the answer on that one. But there are real efforts among immigration advocates in the U.S. to figure out how to rework this, because it is a bizarre situation. Because just the practical realities of what's happening in lots of communities around the U.S. now, where people are terrified to come out of their house, they're not going to work, or all kinds of abuses are happening because it's a bit of a free-for-all for people who are not documented.
Tanya, I'm sorry, I was talking about reproductive rights.
Okay. Well,
okay.
Reproductive rights. I don't know. I don't work on that in that sense. I'm sorry.
But
or let me just ask it differently. So when you are trying to really change the narrative, so right, how can Human Rights Watch partner? Macarena had a really great presentation for us a few years ago on the topic, and how they were really able to work with partners like in Latin America and get the law changed, but it all started with the story.
So you're talking about the work in the U.S. on reproductive justice. Yeah, I can say, we have to make decisions about the work that we can and cannot do, like what we have capacity to do. So this is not one that we're deeply engaged in, but we are connected to partners on it. And I can't imagine that the experience of the developments in Latin America aren't being infused into this movement. I think a lot of people in the U.S. are really shocked about what's been happening. I actually think they thought that Roe was going to stand, and maybe there's still like a lot of kind of shock around it. But I do believe in the next generation, and I believe in the folks who are out there, that people are creative, and it's just a matter of time. It's just we keep getting hit with a really big stick every couple of weeks with something else, But Human Rights Watch can definitely help with that infusing. And so,
I think it's also a good question to talk to Macarena and her team, and also our comms team about reframing the narrative. I know the ACLU, for example, launched a campaign around forced pregnancy, so just the language that you use. Pam, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I thought the question was more like about terminology.
Yeah, the language. Yeah.
How the pro-lifers won the battle, the battle of words when they coined the phrase pro-life, which makes us what? Pro-death. And but there was another point I was going to make. Sorry, I'm really jet-lagged. I know. There was a film of several years ago. It's back to the film, The Power of Film, about a woman named Maria, and she was an immigrant to the U.S. She was in the rose growing business. Anybody remember that film? And it's about, she comes to the U.S. and she's in Queens, and it's about her life there. Anybody? It was called, it had some punning title, Maria, Mother of...
Full of Grace, is it?
Yes, exactly. So, it seems to me that a vehicle like that, a film like that, or a TV show like that shows, the story of one immigrant and their journey could be very powerful in this moment.
Definitely, and I think there's kind of two ways that we are approaching this work. Number one is we also say when we speak to these production companies and studios that we have over 40 years of incredible reporting and research that they can use as IP for the first time, and they could develop shows and films around that work, and we'd be there to help them. But the other side of the work is saying we don't have to have the one film that's about this issue, because actually human rights is in everything, in every TV show, and it could be a comedy, it could be a drama, it could be something set within the criminal justice system in a prison, and that's a very obvious place for us to get involved. But it also could be an international spy thriller, and how do we weave those people and those truths into all of these shows, so that anyone who's turning on the TV is getting a representative look at our world that's an authentic telling of it, and not one that kind of is, lacking in nuance, lacking in authenticity, with one-dimensional characters. So films like that are very important, but I think what we're trying to also do is get those types of characters into all of our shows.
Right.
Hi. I'm Ashley from New York. Was just curious if any thought has been given back to the narrative question on how democracy is, I guess, used as a narrative or doing work around democracy, just because, thinking about the last election, I feel like the Democratic Party used democracy and just saying, like hanging that sort of, over everyone's head, like we heard about it, democracy is on the ballot or whatever, but it didn't work. And I'm just curious how, or if Human Rights Watch is perceiving like doing work with communities around a better understanding of the importance of democracy.
Yeah, that's.
I want to hear from you and Bruno on that one. So, Tanya, you start.
Can I just hot pursuit that? Because actually, I think it was you, Tanya, that said in the earlier session, they won on this false economic opportunity or maybe it was Arvin, but this idea that people really bought into something that the Republicans were going to offer to fix the fact that they're living in extreme poverty. And I think there is something to be said that we're not connecting the issue of rights to economic well-being, and a reshaping of that narrative or talking about things in that way. So very much connected to this issue, and even the word democracy, for example, where people are, I just want to be able to buy my groceries, right? So where does that go in terms of, and I don't think we're talking about this enough, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, okay, thank you for those questions. So in terms of democracy, we decided when we started our democracy work a couple of years ago that we would use the term but not rely on the term because it's so nebulous. Like, what does it mean? And what does it include or not include? And the way we ended up deciding to talk about it, at least right now, is the right to vote and the three kind of phases of the right to vote, right? So prior to actually pulling the lever, you have to be educated. You have to be informed. Education is freedom. In fact, like I take it all the way back. Like there's a reason that enslaved people were prohibited from learning to read because education is freedom. And that's why the state of Florida is banning books. And that's why, we have kids now who don't know who Harriet Tubman was or, what lynching is because 1 year matters in education. And so you have a bad law that passes 3-4 years ago. You've got 3-4 years worth of kids who don't know certain things. That's going to inform your electorate. So you've got to work on that as part of the human right to vote is education and information. Then the next phase is actually pulling the lever and exercising that right. That's about eligibility. And we do a lot of work around, for instance, felon disenfranchisement, because we've got that problem in the United States. I think I mentioned that also. For more than 4 million people who can't vote, but also voter intimidation, mis and disinformation, and we link that to authoritarian trends because that's an essential part of undermining the political system is that people don't know what to believe, and you perpetrate false information, and then so their vote continues to be uninformed. And then voter intimidation itself, which is like classic kind of like, on the courthouse steps, like keeping people from voting. And then the third phase of democracy, or kind of ensuring our right to democracy or ensuring our right to vote, is breathing life into black and brown, in particular, black and brown political power. So you are educated, you pull the lever, you vote people in, and then they must have the political power to do something, right? So it's about maintaining power, and we've done a lot of research in Jackson, Mississippi that's hopefully coming out this summer about communities that duly elected black political leadership has been completely undermined by the state-wide white power structure of the state of Mississippi, and how that is actually democracy too, and that's really also about the right to vote. And so I think breaking it up sometimes helps. I don't think we have the answer, but that's one way that we've been dealing with it. And then in terms of economic justice and equity and things, we are always linking it in our work. I mean, it's not central to our work in the U.S. program, but it is central to the issues. So we also partner with organizations that do have that as first priority. So when we're talking about criminal legal system, we're talking about economic injustice as well. When we're talking about immigration, we're talking about economic justice as well. So just some ideas. But it's, narrative change is the drips and drabs. It's going to be a lifetime. Bruno,
do you know anything to add from the...
She's going to make you talk.
Yeah, maybe from the foreign policy point of view. Human Rights Watch doesn't do a ranking of democracies, first of all, but obviously democracy needs to deliver. And it needs to deliver not only on the civil and political rights, but also on economic, social, and cultural rights. So over now a number of years, Human Rights Watch has been developing, I think, a quite comprehensive body of work on precisely how democracies need to deliver. Because in some societies, they're being offered a false choice. And this is maybe, just to make it simple, the China model. We will give you a certain degree of economic empowerment that will improve your conditions of life relative to your previous generation. But in exchange, you will not have any civil and political rights. And that was the model that China was basically metastasizing around the world under the so-called One Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, whatever you want to call it. And that became actually a quite attractive mantra for a good number of states that one could call either liberal democracies or just but not necessarily full-fledged democracies. That got a lot of currency with a number of heads of state, heads of government who had autocratic tendencies that thought that to the degree that I could deliver on some economic empowerment, I can continue to restrain civil and political rights. So I do think that it is incumbent on all of the truly liberal electoral democracies to make damn sure that they are delivering on the economic side. Because unfortunately, what we're seeing in some cases, and I don't want to say this is everywhere, but for example, I've been based in France for a long time. In France, you have President Emmanuel Macron. Internationally, I think he's relatively well perceived. Yet what is the true travesty in France is that the one party that speaks most about economic empowerment issues is the extreme right. Marine Le Pen and her party are the ones that do not miss a single opportunity to talk about the bread and butter issues. It is not the Socialist Party. It is not the far left. It is the extreme right. And this maybe catches up with something that has been happening in the US in other contexts, where you have, yes, false pronouncements about empowering people economically, whereas those that they are trying to basically bring under their wing are precisely those that will be most affected once their policies are actually enacted. And this basically speaks to the large failure of many of the traditional parties that had been basically had as their base economic empowerment, that they are not delivering because either they're trying to far out left the left, or in most cases, they're trying to outright the right. And they're abandoning those core issues that are essential to the social contract. Without a social contract, there can be no democracy.
Do we have one more question over here? Dean.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no. Yeah, it's basically partly answered, but Bruno, you said earlier to link up with unlikely allies. If I transfer that into the education need there is about democracy, isn't there a way to link up? I don't know, you're talking entertainment business, maybe there are other institutions in the US, I'm not familiar with the US as much, where you can come up with something. I mean, some film, some movie, which gives you some democratic red thread in the story. I mean, find someone who does it, but being fed with insights maybe delivered or researched by Human Rights Watch. Maybe, I don't know, but I feel like the education is crucial.
Hello. I'm just wondering. Listening to all this. We're blaming governments and et cetera. But I just wonder. There's a whole other piece here that's capitalism and business that has really, I think, warped over the years. It's the whole business school. Shareholder equity is the main driver, and now you've got these companies over the years. Like think about Walmart in the 80s and the 70s. They pushed all this business as China, lower costs for in North America, cheap labor. We took away all the pension plans. We fire people indiscriminately. And so what's happened is, especially in the U.S., I think other Canada as well, but there's this huge discrepancy between the very wealthy and the very poor. And I really think that's a fundamental problem that these countries have to deal with. Like you can see the billionaire class now, what they're doing, they're making themselves richer. It's making the poor poorer. The gap is just continuing to grow and grow. And I don't know, how the government is going to really change that, even if there's another government in power. So I don't know if there's a role for Human Rights Watch in looking at the way business is conducted, the way capitalism, shows no responsibility or very little. What's the minimum wage in the U.S.? Like $7 or something. And, so, we've got all these, people that are, working on these farms for no wage, yet the companies are making billions of dollars of profit, and Cargill, et cetera. So anyway, I just wonder, is there a role for Human Rights Watch to expose the travesty of these large corporations and what they've done to the working class?
Yes, I'll just quickly say, in the United States, we have done work around, for instance, child labor. We get at it not grandly. We try to get in, in a kind of more precise context. So we've done work on child labor. We just released a report on the gig economy, which should be a lesson to all of you who use Uber and the other services, and like hooking human beings up to algorithms for their livelihood that's completely independent of human control is really telling about where our society is going. So we do things like that in the U.S. It's not a like wholesale comprehensive condemnation, but then we also, as I said earlier, partner with groups that do the kind of wholesale comprehensive condemnation, and where we align, we work together, and then we also go off into the other areas that we address.
Maybe from a larger context, I see several Europeans in this room, and I don't know whether you are fond or not of the European Union, and I know that that's a touchy issue in many EU elections and constituencies. But if there is something that globally I think is a testament to the possibilities of the European Union to be relevant and to actually bring some added value, is its regulatory power. And I'm not talking about the regulatory power, as to precisely how many ounces of a particular pesticide you can use in Germany or in France. I'm talking about the regulatory power that the EU has been building, for example, to try to regulate the large social digital firms, AI firms, through regulations that are forcing them to be a lot more protective of consumer rights, for example, whereas in the US, it remains a totally unregulated market. What the EU has been doing, obviously with ups and downs, for example, on corporate supply chains and due diligence, which puts EU corporations in a very, very strong footing, but creates obligations for others to basically follow. And that is precisely why you have US senators and members of Congress and US governors trying to undermine the EU's regulatory powers on that, saying that that is a hostile trade maneuver on the US. Or, for example, the EU regulatory powers to try to ban forced labor. So I think all of these are actually extraordinary developments by the EU that Human Rights Watch has been supporting. Many of those advances that are taken in the EU Parliament, but also need to be, of course, ratified by each one of the EU member states. We have been supporting them, supporting Human Rights Watch research behind those findings on forced labor in Uzbekistan, forced labor in China, which Human Rights Watch has documented, on corporate supply chains, the auto industry in China, for example, that we have done in Germany a lot. So we're trying to do that. And at least now that we're facing an increasing chance of just absolute deregulation in the US, and the possibility of that being metastasized elsewhere, It is, I hope, that the EU will continue to use its power as the sole of the three superpowers, China, US, EU, the sole one that has the capacity to somehow play an influence for positive regulation that will somehow address the many dangers and risks that you have been referencing.
All right. Well, we are at time. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your insight, and thanks everyone for your excellent questions.